everyone, and thank you for joining me. I'm Tracy Harris, and this is At Home in My Head, the podcast that explores life in the cottage at Woodland Corners. Last week in part 1, Jen Peeples, Phil Session, and I discussed post-election issues. This week, we continue the next hour of that discussion. We had another issue that was the concerns about the Senate majority that's in play here. So they held, the House was held under a Democrat majority, but now we've got a Senate where literally it has come down to 2 runoff races in Georgia. It just does not get any closer than this. So before we start that discussion, I just want to say that when I post this, I'm going to include a Act Blue link for donating to those Senate runoffs in Georgia. So if people want to support it, if you're not in Georgia and you can't vote in the runoffs, you might still want to send help. So there'll be a link that you can donate, or if you don't have the money to donate, you can share it. Just make sure to get the word out that these are important elections and people need to be ready to go to the wall, because there are possible negative implications to winning the presidency and losing the Senate. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about that. I think, Phil, you wanted to talk some about HUD and homelessness. I just wanted to point out first that we have a situation where the cabinet nominees are going to go through the Senate. So if Biden wants to appoint cabinet nominees, they have to be confirmed through McConnell's Senate, and there could be some problems there. The issue that I have is that Trump has set a precedent of putting in acting temporary heads of these different departments. And as far as I'm concerned, I think it would be good if Biden wants to attempt a few to see how it goes. Go ahead and put some appointees through to see if they get confirmed. And if he runs into trouble, I would say go with the precedent that the last administration set and put them in place, and let's just move on. There's no point fighting the Senate over that. There's other fights to be had. I think with the cabinet, there is a workaround if he's willing to do it, and I certainly would avail myself of that almost immediately. I would say, here's an opportunity to confirm a couple of appointees. You either do it or you don't. I'm not screwing around with this. We have other things to do and work to do, and if the appointees are going to be a problem, then I will just take them off the table, put them in place. They will be acting, and I will just juggle them as needed. Or like Trump did, keep them in place even after it's not legal for them to be there. I mean, I don't know if I would go that route. I would probably still stick within the law, but I would definitely not put up with any of the fuckery that the Senate might throw out there to try and just gum up the works. Nobody needs that right now. Things have to go forward. Give them an opportunity to work with you. If they won't, then just say, okay, I tried. It's off the table now. Let's look at something else. I will take care of my cabinet myself. And with that, you were talking about some concerns about HUD, I think, or executive orders.
Yeah, just kind of looking at what would be that worst case scenario. So this is, the runoffs in Georgia, you're looking at Democrats, John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock. Those are the runoffs that are going to be happening. And that election date, I think it's January 5th, if I'm not mistaken. And so it's some time leading up there. So if you're in Georgia, make sure you're registered and all that other kind of good stuff. But it's a huge thing. So people may remember back to Obama's second term when the control of the Senate was lost to Republicans, and you had McConnell that was sitting right there to say, we will not allow, not one thing is going to get by, not one thing is going to get by, and using that power that the Senate controls. I mean, your Senate controls your judges that are confirmed. He held those up and then started throwing them in under Trump, getting all of these conservative justices in, which can affect our policies and laws for decades from all kinds of levels of federal judiciary system. But even if the worst case scenario, hard to think about, but it is, where if these two, they lose their races and it stays in Republican control, and that's, maybe 52-48, maybe 51-49 majority Republican, something like that. But even within that, the executive branch, as we've seen, as Trump has done so many of these actions, there's a lot of control of how they can enforce laws. And so when you look at like the border, for example, you had Jeff Sessions sitting right there talking about, this is how we're going to interpret the law. This is how we're going to enact these laws. So the Customs and Border Patrol, how they receive people that are coming and looking for asylum. There's nothing that dictates that, oh, well, you need to lock them up. We separate the children. We need to separate them right now, put them over here into this private camp that's engorging this private camp holder, whatever private prison system that is. These were choices that were made on an administrative level by the executive branch. And so even in a loss of the Senate, Biden and his administration, whether they're acting officials, acting attorney generals, whatever it is, regardless of what they are, they can start making changes that can affect millions of lives around. And the border is just one prime example. That was one of the big stories. I mean, it still is a big story, but it's fallen off of radars for a lot of people because it's not as in your face as it used to be. Children in cages, the whole 9 yards.
Right.
But that was their choice that they made, not a legislative choice, but an administrative choice by the executive branch and the Attorney General's office to say, this is how we're going to treat them.
Just to help make it a little more clear to folks who might have trouble understanding what you're saying, because some people will say, that was the law. That was the law under Obama. It was the same law, right? I mean, it's the same law. So why are you freaking out now just because Trump is enforcing it? And it's like you're saying, it's about how it's enforced. There is a distinction. One way to think of it in terms of a less complex system is you get stopped by a cop for speeding. Sometimes you get a ticket, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you get a warning. Or the cop stops you because you have a tail light that's out and you say, I didn't know it was out. Thank you for telling me. I'll get it fixed. And the cop gives you a little citation. He says, okay, this is fine. If you get it fixed before this date, just let the courts know and you're fine. Or they'll just say, that's okay. Just take care of it. Have a nice day, let you go. So there's a lot of ways the cop can handle it. He can give you a ticket for the taillight that's out. He can give you a ticket for speeding, but he doesn't have to. It's not a requirement that he do it. And it's not considered a dereliction for him to use his judgment and say, just be more careful, go on your way. The cop has that discretion, is allowed that discretion. What Trump's policy was, what his AG enacted was saying, from now on, anybody who's stopped gets a ticket. If you're stopped for speeding, you get a ticket. If you're stopped for a taillight, you get a ticket. We're taking that discretion out of the hands of the police. He doesn't get to decide whether or not to let you go, whether or not it was a problem, whether there is no context that we're going to consider anymore. Everybody gets a ticket across the board. You have the same law. Nothing has changed about the law. It's just about now you have no flexibility for using discretion about who should or shouldn't get a ticket, and there might be times when that works to, a good advantage, that it makes it more fair because everyone's getting a ticket. But it can also be a problem because there might be times when you don't think somebody should get a ticket when you don't. And when you're saying about taking children away, you have a situation where if you come across the border and you've got a child with you and you also have a bag of cocaine that you're smuggling in, I might say, we're going to take that child away. We need to find other accommodations for this child because you're not just a person coming in here to get, you and your family in here, but you're a drug smuggler. When you say everybody, then you get somebody that comes across and they're just like, look, I'm just here to seek asylum. I've got my kid with me. I don't want any trouble. I just want a better life. And you're just like, nope, we're taking your kid away because that's the law. Take your kid away. We have that right. And so we're going to do it. You sometimes have to use discretion because there's a context involved with what's going on. It's not just about a law is or isn't broken. There's situational influences that can make an impact on how somebody is judging this in the moment. And usually we want people who have the capacity to have good judgment, who are making those decisions so that you don't have horrible negative biases driving it. You don't want racist cops making the judgment about who gets a ticket and who doesn't. What you want is a fair cop who's going to make a decision about who gets a ticket and who doesn't get a ticket. And that's hopefully what you would do in the situation with immigration, is have people in place who are capable of making good judgments. Even the judges in the courts and the immigration courts are complaining, right? Because they're just basically being shoved through. Cases are being shoved through. They're not getting a fair hearing. These are people's lives at stake. These are lives and families. These are people putting everything on the line to come here and make their case, and they are not being given a fair hearing. And I think everybody is suffering here. The advocates that are down at the border are complaining. The judges that are down at the border are complaining. The immigration courts are not run like other courts. Mm-hmm. And those judges being given quotas and things. Like, I'm hearing all kinds of awful stuff about what's happening with those courts. But you don't have to necessarily change the law in order to figure out how you're going to deal with the law as a policy. It's two different questions. And right now, the way we're dealing, I mean, immigration has always been a nightmare in this country. Almost can't even say that without going back to the idea that people who basically invaded and colonized and committed mass atrocities to the indigenous populations are now putting up walls and saying, we're going to restrict who can come in. Like, we're the ones that have to be afraid. And so we're looking at a situation where we're putting up all these blockers. And the weirder thing is it's blockers for indigenous people coming from other parts of the Americas, right? So we're literally putting up borders to keep out indigenous people from coming to the north part of the continent. The absurdity of it just it just sort of breaks my brain when I start thinking about what we're doing here.
I know, and they're like, no, I just want to visit my cousin.
Yes. It's very weird. Since we are doing immigration, whether rightly or wrongly, we do it very badly. The U.S. has never been really good at immigration. We haven't ever really gotten it right. So it's not like there was this heyday of fantastic immigration policy that we can go back to and say, if only it could be like that again. It's never been great, right. But it has been worse at other times. And so this is right where we're at now is pretty bad.
And a lot of that, as you said, it has a lot to do with what the executive branch, how they interpret the law and how they apply that law to those individuals. And one of the examples that, I focus on just in my work with Austin Atheists Helping the Homeless, being in that arena for so long. So there was an act passed. This was back in 2015. So this was during Obama's term. It's called the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Act. There was still a lot of disparity around the country, even in those that received services from providers, from those that service people that are experiencing homelessness. There were a lot of disparities in how that assistance was being given out, essentially. Gender components, gender orientation, sexual identity. There was a lot, I'm getting my words mixed up, sexual orientation. There was a lot of factors that were there that were concerning because some people were getting underserved. Just because you may have a provider that may not agree with them, or there's a multitude of factors. So I won't simplify it, but that was what this act was brought forth to address. And so it essentially required that local communities that are receiving federal housing and urban development dollars, because they give out millions to individual communities. Like Travis County, I think, got a little over between $10 and $12 million in this year. Like, they're still getting it right now for providers that are providing services to those experiencing homelessness. So for those communities, they would have to make a concrete data and community member driven plan to foster thriving communities within that continuum of care. That's what it's called, like the area of which it serves. And so this included data of tracking who was being served, looking at the factors such as race, your gender identity, if it's a victim of domestic violence, youth homelessness, veteran homelessness, disability homelessness, looking at those trends, who's being served, in what way, how are they escaping homelessness, what are the success rates of people that are escaping homelessness and don't fall back into it. And those types of numbers are tracked. And so it was an entire plan to say that you cannot ignore these pieces just because you don't want to deal with it. Everybody needs to be at the table to talk together about what is going on in the community, what things are working, what things are not, etc., so that everyone, including the people that are getting, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to solve this problem, even they need to be at the table so they can know from advocates in the homeless community. So for Travis County, for example, there's the Youth Homeless Collective, there's the Homeless Advocacy Group that's there. These are people that have experienced homelessness or are currently experiencing homelessness, they get to sit at the table with everybody else, the VA, everybody. These are all the big people to say, these are the issues that are there. This is what's happening, and that's why these folks are not getting help, that type of thing. That's what this rule was encouraging, to make sure everybody is on the same accord and they're actually trying to solve the problems that people are facing, rather than leaving people in the dust and focusing on a particular subset of individuals to the detriment of others that really need assistance. This is under Carson. Oh my goodness, Ben Carson.
Ben Carson, yeah.
Yes, who leads the federal housing and urban development. Well, they didn't like this rule too much. Even though they couldn't change the law, they couldn't do anything about that. But what they could do is say, well, we'll delay the timeline as to when this thing should take effect. We're going to delay when these communities need to have this plan driven together in a quote coming directly from federal HUD. This is one of their press releases that they released. They said, quote, that this program is a waste of time. Like that's the way they said, that they want to put control over the providers of homelessness into the local control there at the local level. But the fact is, it already is in their control. What it's doing is making sure that everybody in that local continuum of care is working together to address the problems of disparity, even in regards to providing assistance to those experiencing homelessness, because there's a large divide there. Austin is made up of 8 to 10% African Americans, and yet has 35%, at the last time that I looked at the figures, 35% of people experiencing homelessness in Travis County are African American,
right?
For example, which is a huge gap and
right.
a huge underserving of that population, and something that if we don't address it, we need to address what's going on in this particular region. And so that was a policy that Carson put down, and that filtered out to all of the HUD recipients of funds. When we're talking about the changes that can be made on the executive branch, even without the help of the Senate passing a law to correct this or whatever else, who's in those positions, who's leading these particular departments, the Department of Education and Betsy DeVos, you have all of these different positions that are sitting here that can have huge effects on people's lives in the local communities around the U.S. It is a huge issue, let alone the Secretary of State that interacts with other countries and our foreign policy that's dictated through that office. And so even without the Senate majority, even if we lose that, which I would hate, but it is a potential thing coming down the line. Biden, if he comes in like a effing wrecking ball and says, okay, we're putting people in, you can, as Tracy said, you can either put them in or they're going to be acting people for a long time. They're going to be acting secretaries left and right, whatever. But they can make such huge changes that affect your life, like your lives in your local community. It has a huge effect. And not a lot of people are cognizant of that. This having all branches would be nice. Well, at least the legislative and executive branch would be nice. But even if not, you can still push and advocate for changes at the executive level so that these particular cabinet positions and secretary positions and all these administrators that actually do affect your lives in some way can be filled and changed in ways that for the betterment of your community.
Right.
And so never discount the power that comes in that side.
Yeah. And the other thing is, wait, what was that third branch of government again? We got 3 branches, right? What was that? So, okay, so we've got the judiciary.
Yes.
And we need to remember that what we haven't seen so far is what the impact is going to be of the 200 conservative judges that were installed with McConnell and our new Supreme Court. So even if we take the Senate and even if we get a president that will issue executive orders or new policies, all we need is like a litigious side of the conservative ranks to challenge a lot of what can be done to see what happens through these conservative courts. So we haven't seen yet what that's going to mean, because that's part of like Obama did a lot through executive order in his second term when he just saw that there was not going to be any getting anything through Congress. Part of what the result of that is now we're looking at ACA getting sued, right? People are suing ACA, and what's going to stand and what's going to fall, what's going to happen to it? What's going to happen to healthcare now? What little strides that he was able to legislate with a pen, basically, what's going to happen to that now that the courts are now filled with a judiciary that isn't probably going to be real supportive of liberal policy?
I was reading something recently where someone was saying that because of the pandemic, Biden actually will have the ability to essentially put anyone who wants to be on Medicare or Medicaid to cover their expenses during the pandemic. That is something that's interesting to me. You know, if the ACA falls, okay, hey, let's do this. And it would be interesting if people find out that they like public health, especially in times of, a pandemic. What would that do for support a universal single payer coverage in this country? Which I remind people we could have had during the first Clinton administration if Republicans hadn't been so opposed to it, the healthcare plan that Hillary Clinton came up with as First Lady. And of course, there were Democrats who were quite squeamish about pushing forward with that as well.
I mean, even in Obama's first term, where there was a supermajority in the Senate of Democrats, like that was the time.
Yes.
Like, if you're gonna do it, this is it. It's just one of those things. It's just like what the heck have? But since all of these changes in the course, like people like it used to be called Project Blitz. From what I'm reading now, they've renamed themselves to Freedom for All.
Oh, they've rebranded. That's interesting. Yes, I guess Freedom Project Blitz got too infamous.
Oh my goodness! But like that was a group that, like, they just printed out legislation and could give it to state legislatures to say, hey, pass this. And as long as you were in a conservative legislature, in both houses, get it passed, even though you knew it's going to be knocked down, it would be challenged, of course, in the courts, which is what they ultimately want. So it can pass through federal judgeships for the off chance that a judge will say, you know what, I have no problem with this law. This one is good to go. And it gets challenged again. And if it makes it to the Supreme Court, now you have Barrett that's on the Supreme Court. You have the 6-3 conservative majority that's happening. What happens if one of these Freedom for All bill, comes before them that says, well, a business owner should have the religious freedom to deny this service to this individual because that individual conflicts with a truly and sincerely held religious belief by the owners thereof. And even though, in Barrett's, every justice that gets confirmed, they always say, I'm non-judgmental, I can't make decisions. It's the usual refrain that you hear, of course.
Right.
But what happens if they say, you know what, I like that, and that doesn't conflict with the title rights of the non-discrimination. Oh my goodness, was it Title VII, if I'm not mistaken, which is discrimination based on gender orientation now, which was one of the newer reinterpretations. Was that just this year? Or just this year that case came before about
it was pretty
being denied,
recent.
Yeah, transgender. I think it was a transgender individual, and I thought there was also another one, somebody that got fired or let go because their employer found out that they were gay. Right. And that was considered discrimination based on gender, not necessarily of the person, but of the individual that they were attracted to or with.
The question was about, I think it's in the law, I think it's stated as sex. And so what those cases were dealing with was the idea of, is that encompassing of like gender or orientation? And I think what they found was, yes, that should be included. And so it's like a weird way of sort of extending an umbrella protection to groups whose protections were questioned by people who were saying, well, if I discriminate against you because you're gay, that's not discrimination based on sex. And what these cases were saying is, yes, it is. Because if you fire a man who's married to a man, but you would not fire a woman who's married to a man, then that's discrimination based on sex.
Right. Which was the same justification in Obergefell in 2015, but that was specifically talking about marriage in particular, and this was your job discrimination that was coming to the forefront. But there's nothing that's stopping this conservative-leaning 6-3 majority, as I'll say that again, to say that, you know what, no, that doesn't. We're going to go ahead and overturn this. That doesn't infringe on anyone's right. They're free to go to another bakery. They're free to go to another establishment. Like, there's nothing preventing them from getting this service taken care of at another reasonable, accommodated place within their particular city or whatever else. And it's like this looming fear that's sitting in the background about what's going to be brought before the Supreme Court and what might they overturn now that they have this majority that's there. And so that is going to be a scary thing to just kind of watch. And that's all that can really happen right now, is just watching to see what they end up doing. Like, putting more justices on the court is one thing, but I think that's going to be a long shot. Like, there's some discord even within the Democratic Party about what the best solution and way forward is. But
there's a lot of ways it could be restructured, though. I remember when Pete Buttigieg was running, he talked about wanting to restructure the courts, and this was before it even became as hotbed like what did after the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. He was doing this during the primaries and saying that we need to redo it, that the court has become too politicized. And so he had a plan where he was saying what we need is a split where we've got 5 that are conservative leaning, 5 that are liberal leaning, and then 5 that are jointly chosen. And so he wanted to have it to where it would be less partisan. Now, that was just his initial kind of thought, but I'm pretty sure that if we put our heads together, we could come up with a solution that says, here's a way to sort of deal with the partisanship that's infected the judiciary at this point.
It's definitely there. Like, there's no getting around it. And in the confirmation hearings, you always hear about, oh, they're trying to make this a partisan issue, and this is a well-oiled, very competent individual. We're just trying to put him there. And it's just like, we all know, like, they didn't get there by accident. Like, they were chosen.
They were chosen by the Federalist Society. Right. It's like the Federalist Society is who is nominating our judges, basically. They hand the president, the conservative presidents, a list of this is who you choose from. The president picks, one and throws it over to the Senate. There's some very interesting information about the Federalist Society. I'm trying to remember where I saw that. I'll have to try and look it up and see if I can find it. Someone had done some research into different conservative groups and how they were sort of juggling individuals back and forth, and they're funneled full of dark money so that you end up putting in, I think it was like $200 million or $250 million for the installation of Barrett.
What I'm looking at right now, as far as donors, like, you're looking at like Koch family, Mercer's.
I do remember who it was. Yeah. It was one of the, I think it was one of the senators actually at the hearings. I'm going to Google that while talk amongst yourselves.
Did you have something to add to it, Jen?
No, I was actually just pulling up Twitter to check on that Million MAGA March again.
Oh, good.
So, one of the signs one of these jackasses carrying is saying, "Make America Great Again, ban homo marriage."
Because that's what messed it up.
Yeah. There's another picture of the Blue Lives Matter flag flying right next to the Nazi flag with the swastika. So, yeah. Kurt Eichenwald is saying, he tweets, "Every one of you evil Republican, but judges and tax cuts, you will never be able to wipe the stink off of you. These are your allies. These are you. Whether you want to admit it or not, you are no different than the Germans who supported Hitler for financial benefit."
I was able to find the senator. Just let me interject here for 1 second. I was able to find it was Senator Whitehouse, and he did a presentation that was excellent. He knew he couldn't stop the nomination, but he went ahead and just did a presentation on this is how judges like Barrett, and specifically Barrett, have been nominated, and this is the problem with it. I'm going to include a link to the video presentation that he did, because it was really awesome explanation of how dark money is fueling the SCOTUS nominations, at least from the Federalist Society side.
What was funny about the like just the march and looking out there. Like I remember like when Trump got elected and the Women's March, and you can look it up on Wikipedia, like the 2017 Women's March that was there. But in the U.S., it was estimated between 3.2 and 5.2 million people across the U.S. And like Washington alone was 470,000 people in Washington after Trump got elected. You know, the largest was one of the largest worldwide protests still on record, if I'm not mistaken. But Trump sent out a tweet saying something along the lines of hundreds of thousands have come out or something like that. And it was more along the lines, it was like tens of thousands, something like that. But it doesn't seem to be like a concrete number as of yet, but it definitely is dwarfed by pictures I'm seeing just of the Women's March. And I've forgotten how large that march really was when Trump won. It was massive.
I want to tweet back at him, dude, they rang the church bells in Paris when you lost.
Yeah.
Like we had overthrown a dictator.
I mean, it's so funny, like just thinking about how outside countries are looking at the U.S., everything that's happened here, like what could you possibly think? Like it's hard for me to put myself in their shoes. Like, I mean, I see, of course, comedy stories, like little things on YouTube or something like that, coming from their perspective, but to actually watch it from another country and be like, this is real. Like, those people elected this. They put them there.
I've seen so many mixed responses to this 2020 election, right? So from people congratulating us and saying they knew we could do it, to people who have written and said, I'm really pissed off, don't ever do that to us again. Like as far as the last 4 years, like don't you ever do that to the globe again. One thing I will say is not in the Trumpian, you have to shoulder your fair share way, but in a cautionary tale way, I hope that the rest of the globe has learned not to rely on the US so heavily. I really do like, of course, as someone living in the US, it's to my benefit that our country be involved globally as much as possible. I want as much political influence as we can wield legally and ethically in communities. I want us to be in deals with nuclear arms. I want us to be in things that affect the environment. I want us to be included in those discussions and participants in those discussions and supportive of positive global policy. I know that we don't always live up to the best standards, and sometimes global influence can be a negative thing. But when you live in a country, you want that country to be involved in as much as possible with other countries in a global community. You don't want to be left out of those conversations and disempowered and disenfranchised. Everybody should be included and participating and be a partner in these things with good intentions. You want good actors making good decisions about everyone's welfare. At the same time, though, apparently things can go wrong with us. And when that happens, if we are a global leader who is shouldering, when we're the ones that are sort of carrying most of that burden, what happens when we fall? And that's something that I think other countries had to really seriously think about in the last 4 years. And I hope that they don't look at this as like a blip on the radar and now we can go back to business as usual. I really want to see other countries step up and assert themselves and assert their power and own some of this. Again, not in a way that I feel like the U.S. has been treated unfairly, but I feel like that we may have created an environment of disenfranchisement and complacent attitudes among other nations who felt like we would always be there. And now, as a U.S. citizen, I don't feel like we can be trusted to be there like we need to be there. And I really hope that other countries will form coalitions. I understand some of them are smaller, they have smaller budgets, smaller militaries, and that's why something like the EU is really important. Those nations have to find a way to come together and have a coalition and make themselves empowered by numbers, if nothing else. Because there has to be, there can't just be one nation setting policy. It has to be a community setting policy, and our neighbors and our allies need to be empowered to do that. I hope they take this last 4 years as a cautionary tale and find a way to sort of have a backup plan in case things go south here.
And that's one of the reasons why alliances like NATO are so vitally important, because you do have a coalition of nations who basically are saying, hey, an attack on one is an attack on all. We're all on the same team. But yeah, I get what you're saying. It's almost like the world has been in a codependent relationship with us for a long time, and suddenly, all the pretense of that fell away in the last 4 years, and people have had to step up and kind of handle their own shit a little bit, because we cannot be counted on to do that.
Yeah, and I think the United States, because of its size and resource, there is something to be said about the idea of us playing a stewardship role, taking on obligation and responsibility because of our size and because of our capacity for influence. I think we have, what is that Spider-Man quote? With great power comes great responsibility. And so we have to be responsible with how we wield our power. And I'm definitely willing to admit that we don't always do that. And even with a group like NATO, you can have problems, right? It's not ever going to be a perfect system. That doesn't mean that it's a useless system or that it's a system that needs to be abandoned. It just means that you can improve on it and make things better. And we in the United States need to do what we can in the times that we're able to help empower other countries to take more control of their own destinies, to not be as reliant on us, not for our benefit, but for their own benefit.
I'm sure it's a very rude awakening just after all these things, and Trump going to summit meetings and snubbing some folks and cozying up to whether it be Putin or Kim Jong-il, just all kinds of things. It's just what are you even doing? And so I hope that people don't see Biden, because a lot of people on the news, the way that I have been watching on MSNBC and CNN, stuff like that, it's definitely the sigh of relief and an interpretation of a return to normalcy, I think. And I would hope that other countries kind of would learn their lesson, because this has been such a tumultuous 4 years that how could you not have started to adapt things? Or hopefully they weren't just relying on, my goodness, I hope they vote him out the next time. That type of thing. But for Merkel and everybody else, I would hope not. I would hope that they would take some role, or at least want to work with Biden more. I'm sure they'll want to reestablish those connections, of course, because they used to be there before Trump was just oh, to hell with that. No, I don't want that either. And just brazenly in that way. But I hope that they would get some more independence between the UK, even Canada, and Justin. There. I'm saying Justin like I really know this man. Oh my goodness. Trudeau up there. Well, I think they really do.
Earlier, you were talking about this idea that was reminding me of a free fall. You were saying, where does this end? And we were seeing all these different crises that were arising daily or weekly or, several times a day. It was some new wild thing that we were just our heads were spinning with all of the bizarro world stuff that was going on in the last 4 years. When you were talking about it, I was envisioning somebody free falling down a pit, right? You're falling down this pit and you're wondering where the bottom, you were saying, where's the bottom? Where does this end? Where does this stop? And so you're falling and falling and falling. And then finally you manage to grab onto a limb or hit a ledge or something. And it's okay, I've stopped the fall. And then you kind of have to get your head on straight and recognize what just happened and what your situation is. And you have to get your bearings, right? Okay, so I'm down this pit now and I'm standing on this ledge. And so plan B is, or the next phase is, how do I get back up? How do I get out of this pit? How do I get back up to the top? And we are at such a deficit now. A lot of the things that Trump manifested in the population was the horrifying level of racism and misogyny and the bigotry against so many marginalized demographics that just came out in full force, that people just felt so empowered to express and to act on, and to the videos alone of just the entitlement and the hostility toward groups. This was in the population, and now it's activated in the population, and we got to see it. So this wasn't a situation where we fell from a starting point of utopia. We fell from a starting point of a heavily bigoted society where bigots were just a little quieter than they are 4 years later. And so when we think about a return to normalcy, it's kind of crappy because now we have to work just to get back to where we started, which wasn't utopian to begin with. And then we have to work to try to improve it with all of the same obstructions that we were confronted with before Trump took office. You know, all of those obstructions that Obama had to work around constantly are still in play. And it's not going to be pretty. And this is why the Senate is so important. And this is why a restructure of the judiciary is so important. Because right now, we have forces that are obstructing that are very, very much on the side of bigotry and oppression and suppression and regressive concepts of bringing us back to the racism and the misogyny that we lived in, 50 years ago. They want to go right back to that. They see that as the ideal in the United States is the 1950s and the 1940s. So when I look at this, it's sad that we think in terms of a return to normalcy, but I think we do because it would be a relief almost just to get back to that. But I want to assure people that even while we're kind of expressing that with a sense of relief, just knowing that we have an opportunity now to get back to, quote, normal, that doesn't mean that normal is the goal. It doesn't mean that where we were before Trump got elected was perfect and that's what we want to get back to and that's the ideal and that's where the end is. It's still a lot of work to climb back up out of that hole. And then once we get to the top again, we still have to find our way out of that cave, right? We're still in a mess and we still have to fix it. And I don't want folks to think that the point of what we're discussing here is, hey, let's all celebrate. It's all done now. Biden got elected and everything's perfect again. And so now we can just all breathe a sigh of relief and just go back to sleep. It can't be that way. We have to stay active, keep being active. It's never been so important for all of these people that have now gotten up and made their voices heard in these elections to keep making their voices heard. If you send people to Washington and they're sitting there saying, I am expressing the will of the people and I want this policy, if people won't stand up behind them and say, amen, then what you've got is a single person standing there claiming that they're speaking for a lot of people who are now being silent again. We have to have the backs of the people we sent to Washington. We have to have their ear. We have to stand up and make sure that everybody on both sides of the aisles knows what it is we want. Otherwise, they're going to be ineffectual. It's people that power the representatives. And if the people don't show up to back them when they're trying to do what we want, it's going to look really thin and watery, and it's not going to fly.
So no sitting out the midterm.
Amen.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to lose the House on top of everything else.
Right. I mean, we lost seats in the House, and that's not a good message when we're out there trying to push a progressive legislative agenda. Mm-hmm. People are always complaining about Pelosi and she won't do this or she won't do that. She's been pretty masterful at how she's handled herself through all this. If we want her to take up more progressive causes, we're going to have to give her the backing, and the backing is numbers right now.
Yeah.
We did not deliver that. Although I can say my statement that I make every 2 years, Boyd Doggett is still my congressman. So fuck all y'all Republicans that tried to gerrymander him out of office. It didn't work. He's still my congressman. So.
That's cool.
All right.
Well, I need to get going, guys. I got to get up at the crack of dawn and run.
Okay.
Oh, dear.
I get to sleep in. Okay. That's what I always get to say. We do these on Saturdays, and I'm like, I'm sleeping in.
We do sleep in on Sundays, so we don't get up until 4. and we don't run until 5. So Tuesdays and Thursdays we get up at 3:30 and run at 4:30. So Sundays are our sleep-in days.
Yeah. No, to be honest, I'm going to be up really early doing my walk and feeding my cats. It's a fantasy that I sleep in really more than anything. What I did do is I did do my 8-week blood donation down at the Blood and Tissue Center, and I'm super psyched because now I have 2,500 points as soon as they register these 250 points for this last donation, and that means I get the backpack.
Oh,
so I get the We Are Blood branded backpack. I'm so excited. I've been saving points. Yeah, every 8 weeks, 250 points, and I'm going to have the 2,500 points. So that's a lot of weeks. That's a lot of donations. Yes. But I want that backpack. Come for the service to humanity, stay for the merch.
Yeah. So my wife recently donated blood and found out that as part of the blood donations now they're doing COVID-19 testing.
Yes, they have that on their website.
Oh,
yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It totally does.
It's an antibody test, and so she's negative for antibodies. She was bummed because she's like, I was kind of hoping I'd already had it, you know?
Yeah, I think I would know if I had. I don't think I'd be one of those people that's just like, oh, I wonder if this is COVID. I think I would just be like, I'm dying.
Yeah.
I don't think I would do well.
Before I bail, I wanted to throw out another little cool tidbit. I was just reading an article that said that a lot of breeders and shelters have noted an uptick in the number of dogs that have been adopted during the pandemic who are named Fauci.
Oh. That's cute.
I thought the uplifting thing was just like the adoptions had gone up. I was not expecting
people
the Fauci side.
Well, before you leave, I want to say thank you to both of you. So thank you, Jen, and thank you, Phil, for coming on and just sharing your thoughts. It's always great to hook up and talk to you about issues.
I know. I am so looking forward to this pandemic being open or over, so I can go, sit face to face with you guys. We can have coffee again and just talk.
I'm devastated about not having my holiday party. Like there's a chunk of my brain. There's a chunk of my brain that is like, build the fire and just have everyone distance and be outside, right? Like do the whole thing outside. And then there's a part of my brain that's like, just forget it. It's 1 year. Don't do it. Just let it go.
I know. I keep trying to figure out how can I do some kind of appropriately socially distanced thing at the house, that I could have people over, but
I just can't in good conscience do it. I know that people would have to come in and use the restroom. I know that it's like, no matter how careful you try to be, you just don't know. And, it's like, there's a lot of people that come to that party some years. And I'm just going to have to send a note and tell folks that what I was thinking of doing is maybe setting up a page or a site or something where people can interact. Show their houses, share pictures of their Christmas or share, what they got or whatnot. So I don't know, maybe I'll do a thing like that with a closed group or something with the folks I normally have over.
Yeah.
I do like a huge Zoom meeting or something. I don't know.
There you go. You going to host my holiday party on Zoom?
I'll send you a link. I got you.
Oh God, I might do that. Okay, Phil.
I'm very serious about that.
I might hold you to that. That would be awesome to do something. We couldn't do the gift exchange, sadly.
That's true.
But we could, we could have a drink and all hang out and chat for a little bit. All right. Well, thank you all for being on, and I really, really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks.
All right. Bye.
Bye, you guys. That's it for this episode of At Home in My Head, exploring life in the cottage at Woodland Corners. Thanks for listening, and as always, stay safe, be well, and never stop exploring.